I'm going to talk about COVID, lockdown, and the difference between developed and developing countries in this video. Now, I've been lucky enough to live in developing and mid-income countries throughout my life. Obviously, I grew up in the UK, but I've spent time in other developed countries as well, like Japan, but I've also spent time in some very poor countries, such as Cambodia, and also some mid-income countries as well. Now, the interesting thing is, from talking to people around the world, friends, associates, clients, other people, and having lived in those countries, I notice a key difference between the developed countries and the developing countries. Now, when it comes to developed countries, there are a few that basically were in crisis, but then they've kind of become developed more recently. So, for example, maybe some of the Asian countries that have become developed more recently, like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, or whatever, might be exceptions, and also some in the Middle East, like the UAE, Qatar. There are people, especially if they're old people, who have seen bad times. Whereas in a country like the UK, where I grew up in, of course, people have seen bad times, but it is really more the people who are like my grandma's generation. Because if you think about it, since the World War, the UK and other kind of major Western developed countries have never had an incredible crisis. Yes, there's been crisis. So, for example, in the UK, when my parents' generation were young, there was a 3-day work week because of the economy was bad. Obviously, there was the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. There was the oil price going from $2 to $8 in the 1970s. There's been various crises, and of course, there's been various political scandals and all those kind of things, just like any country. However, the last two generations have not experienced incredible hardship, and it's almost going to 3 generations now, because say my grandma's generation, for British people, they were kind of young. If they were like say 90, 91, 92, a lot of them were young when the World War was happening. But what happened with lockdown and coronavirus, many people haven't experienced that kind of thing in peacetime. And of course, because the UK hasn't had a major war since say 1945, where the general populations go into war, I mean, not like the kind of small regional wars, people haven't experienced that kind of thing. People haven't experienced, say, a famine or a civil war. And that's mainly, of course, a good thing. It shows it's a stable country. But what's interesting about that is a few things have happened because of that. Number one, the population does expect the government to do everything for them. So furlough schemes have been much bigger in developed countries, which means taxes will have to go up. Long-term things like healthcare, other benefits might have to be cut. People have a sense of entitlement, and it also leads to problems when it comes to saving and investing as well, because a lot of people, they don't do it for themselves. They assume because they pay taxes, the government should do everything for them. So, if there's a second lockdown or something like coronavirus happens again in 20 or 30 years, again, in a country like the UK and many other developed Western countries, people would expect the government to do something for them. But likewise, people are much more likely to panic, because you take it, if you're in a country like, say, Cambodia, and you hear your parents or grandparents talk about when the Khmer Rouge came to power, you can put a virus into perspective. Even if it's going to kill a couple of million people around the world, you can still put it into perspective. Whereas in comparison, if you think back, in many countries, Western countries in particular, there were people panic buying in supermarkets. There were people buying toilet paper. There were even some people having fights in the supermarket because they were scared, because they've never seen something like that. But from what I gather from reading the news, but also talking to people who lived in some of the countries I've lived in before, in many developing countries, people just didn't do that. And many people might say, well, because a lot of people still can't afford to buy in advance. But I think part of it is people can put it into perspective. They're less likely to panic. Whereas what I have noticed, in the Western world, the developed Western world, this doesn't apply to, say, Eastern Europe or kind of parts of the world which saw things like the fall of the Berlin Wall. Whenever there's an event, people are very likely to panic and indeed give governments extraordinary power. So it could be, for example, 9/11, even though it happened to the US. I can remember being in the UK, people were quite panicked about it, especially when there was other kind of events going on, like there was bombings in Spain, then the UK, 7th of the 7th in 2007. Very few people put it into perspective and said, well, look, there's more people dying of a heart attack today probably than died in that event. That doesn't mean obviously wasn't sad, but people think that now. But at the time, and for the first few months or first few years, people couldn't put it into perspective. Not just that, same in the financial crisis, or whenever there's any event which happens, people really do panic and press the panic button. I can remember 2 or 3 years ago, there was a bombing at the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. An awful bombing because it was mainly teenagers who got affected, and a few teenagers died, and obviously people got injured. Of course, there was wall-to-wall media coverage. There were even people saying, oh, we should intern tens of thousands of people. It was panic. Now that people have calmed down, very few people in the UK would agree with that kind of thing. But the same with coronavirus. Now people have kind of calmed down in the UK. I've noticed a lot more people are saying, hold on, did we really need this or not? But for the first few weeks, even the first few months, almost everyone, because they were in panic mode, supported the measures. So I've noticed a huge difference between the developed world, mainly Western countries, but also maybe this could apply a little bit to a part of the world like Japan, and a few other kind of non-Western countries that have been developed for a long time, and the developing world, including Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, maybe large parts of Latin America as well, where actually more people can put things into perspective. And I've noticed from the point of view of a UK expat or British people who, say, spend 20, 30, 40 years overseas, we're more likely to put things into perspective as well, because we've had conversations with people and that helps us put everything into perspective. I'll give you an example. When I was living in Cambodia, I organized an event there, and there was a Cambodian guy who was talking to us, and it was quite moving because he said, this is the first generation of Cambodians who don't have to worry about starvation. In other words, yes, there's the rich, there's the middle class, and there are still loads of poor people. But now being poor in Cambodia means maybe eating rice. Whereas before, poor meant starvation, death, or maybe you have to find your own insects in the ground, right? For us, that would seem so simple, right? But that kind of helps put things into perspective for people who are living in that country, that things like viruses, terrorist attacks, whatever it is, they're always sad, but it shouldn't be used as an excuse to press the panic button. And I think that's a key difference. So I hope if there's a second wave, if markets crash again, if something like that happens, people can put things in perspective. But what usually happens is people panic, and then further down the road, years later, or say 6 months later, they think, oh, why did I do that? Why did I panic sell? Or why did I agree to the government doing this or that? People often forget that before the Iraq war, most people supported it in the UK. Very few people want to admit that now, but at the time, most people supported it. And obviously this is not a political video because it is a finance channel, but I think it links to finance and investing too, because on my last video, I spoke about market crashes. And one thing I'm interested in finding out, and I kind of suspect the answer to the question, is whether people in developed countries are more likely to panic sell than people in emerging countries. And I suspect the answer is yes. The average British, American, French, German person, I think probably, I don't know this, is more likely to panic sell than somebody, say, I don't know, who's living in a developing country, for the reasons I outlined on this video. Okay, everyone, I've got some really exciting news today. So for a couple of years now, many people have asked me, well, look, I can't afford your minimum investments, but I really like your advice. I don't know if you can do this, or you can do that, or you can help me in that way, or you can't help me in that way. I've always said, no, I can only do this or that, but I've got some really exciting news, and that's that in a couple of months before the end of the year, I will be bringing out what I'm calling the Adam Fayed Academy, which will have many new areas which will be of interest to people. So things like mentoring, tutoring, all those kind of things that people have asked me for in the past. So stay tuned. I'm going to be announcing it in the next few months, but I thought I would tell it to you guys before. Let me know if there's anything in particular that you're looking for in this academy. We're going to be focusing on many different areas, including how to invest productively, also some business areas, because that's another thing people have asked me about before. So stay tuned, and I'll keep you up to date.